The Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women Along the Highway of Tears, Examining Stereotypes and Law Enforcement Failures. The Highway of Tears, an 800-kilometer remote stretch of Highway 16 located in British Columbia, Canada, has gained a grim reputation due to the alarming number of missing and murdered Indigenous women over several decades. This tragedy has drawn national and international attention, prompting calls for justice and reform. Stereotypes and failures within law enforcement have had significant effects on the efforts to address and resolve these crimes. More than 80 women have gone missing along the Highway of Tears. These crimes have been occurring since the 1970s. One of the worst factors contributing to the crisis on the Highway of Tears is the harmful stereotypes about Indigenous women rooted in colonialist attitudes. These stereotypes often paint Indigenous women as marginalized, disposable, or somehow deserving of their plight, which diminishes public empathy and effective intervention. Historically, Indigenous women in Canada have been portrayed through a lens that often depicts them as either hypersexualized or as passive victims. The over-sexualization of Indigenous women is a damaging stereotype that can influence both societal attitudes and institutional responses. This perception reduces Indigenous women to mere objects of desire, erasing their humanity and the complexities of their lives. On the other hand, the portrayal of Indigenous women as inherently vulnerable reinforces the notion that their victimization is an inevitable outcome rather than a consequence of systemic failings and violence. These stereotypes are not just harmful but dangerous, as they can shape how law enforcement agencies perceive and prioritize cases involving Indigenous women. When victims are seen like this, their cases may not receive the attention and seriousness that they warrant. This is particularly evident in the context of the Highway of Tears, where neglect and underestimation of the severity of the crisis have been partly fueled by these harmful perceptions. The disappearance or death of a loved one in Indigenous communities is not just a personal loss, but a community-wide crisis, deeply affecting the emotional, mental, and physical well-being of all family members. Law enforcement agencies in British Columbia have faced significant criticism for their handling of the missing and murdered Indigenous women's cases along the Highway of Tears. These criticisms are rooted in the procedural failures that have contributed to the continuation of the crisis. A major issue is the inadequate response to reports of missing Indigenous women. Often, when Indigenous women go missing, their cases are not treated with the urgency and resources that would be applied to similar cases involving non-Indigenous individuals. This can be attributed to a combination of factors, including racial biases, assumptions with the lifestyle and choices of Indigenous women, and a lack of cultural competence among law enforcement officers. Investigations into these cases have often been met with a lack of coordination and communication between different police jurisdictions. The Highway of Tears spans multiple police districts, leading to fragmented and disjointed efforts in addressing the issue. This fragmentation has resulted in delays in investigations, gaps in information sharing, and an overall lack of strategic focus on solving these cases. For example, the RCMP has been criticized for its slow response and failure to follow up on leads effectively. This has increased the distress of families and communities who are left feeling abandoned and ignored by the institutions meant to protect them. Ray Michalko, whose story is detailed in the documentary Ex-Cop Probes Missing Women's Cases, is a retired RCMP officer and former investigator into the Highway of Tears cases who faced many significant obstacles in his efforts to delve deeper into the pattern of missing and murdered Indigenous women. Despite his dedication, Michalko encountered resistance from within law enforcement that hindered his pursuits. His attempts to investigate into the cases were often blocked by bureaucratic barriers, lack of cooperation from other officers, and a general reluctance to address uncomfortable truths about issues within the RCMP. When Michalko continued to push, he was told if he continued, he would be charged with obstruction of justice. The lack of support and transparency prevented Michalko from fully exploring potential leads and addressing the failings that contributed to the ongoing crisis. His experiences highlight a broader issue within the police force, where internal resistance have obstructed meaningful progress and accountability in resolving these cases. Another critical failure has been the insufficient support for the families of the missing and murdered women. Often, these families are left to navigate the complexities of the legal system on their own, without adequate support or resources. The emotional and financial burdens placed on these families are significant, and the lack of support from law enforcement agencies increases their suffering. This neglect reflects a broader issue where the needs of Indigenous communities are not adequately addressed or prioritized in any area. Addressing the crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women along the Highway of Tears requires an approach that tackles both the stereotypes and failures within law enforcement. There needs to be a concerted effort to challenge and change the harmful stereotypes about Indigenous women. Public education and community outreach can play a crucial role in reshaping perceptions and fostering a more empathetic and informed understanding of the issues faced by Indigenous communities. By promoting a more nuanced and respectful view of Indigenous women, society can contribute to creating a more supportive environment for addressing and resolving these cases. Communities around the province are recognizing the importance of educating the public about Indigenous peoples and their rich cultural histories. Local organizations, schools, and cultural institutions are partnering with Indigenous leaders to create educational programs, workshops, and events that highlight the significance of Indigenous traditions, languages, and histories. Museums and cultural centers often feature exhibits showcasing Indigenous art, history, and contributions to society, while schools are incorporating Indigenous perspectives into curriculum to foster a deeper understanding of their unique worldviews. Public education initiatives such as storytelling sessions and cultural festivals provide opportunities for non-Indigenous people to engage directly with Indigenous communities and learn firsthand from elders and cultural experts. Through these efforts, communities are working to honor Indigenous heritage, raise awareness about ongoing issues faced by Indigenous peoples, and promote respect for their rights and traditions. In terms of law enforcement, there needs to be a significant reform to ensure that cases involving Indigenous women are handled with the urgency and seriousness that they deserve. This could include training on cultural competence and anti-racism to address biases and improve interactions with Indigenous communities. The crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women along the Highway of Tears is a tragic testament to the intersection of harmful stereotypes and failures within law enforcement. Addressing this crisis requires not only confronting and dismantling the stereotypes that dehumanize Indigenous women, but also implementing reforms within law enforcement to ensure that the cases receive the attention and resolution that they deserve. By taking these steps, society can move closer to justice for the affected families and communities, ultimately working towards a future where such tragedies are no longer a reality. You are not forgotten. Throughout researching and creating this presentation, I respected Indigenous protocol by acknowledging the deep cultural significance and wisdom present in all interviews, personal stories, and accounts. I listened and read actively as people shared their experiences and thoughts and took time to reflect and properly understand all content. I respect the fact that the pain of family and community members being ignored and pushed aside is something that is passed down through generations. I recognize that these experiences and stories need to be approached with humility and respect, and that they are not just for entertainment.